I'm only sorry that song didn't have about 7 more verses. Isn't that a beautiful song? Oh, thank you so much. That was a blessing to me. Happy birthday. Is it anybody's birthday today? Well, it is a birthday today. This is the birthday of the world, you know. Last night we discussed the great blessing of creation and how God, after 6 days, made the very first thing he made holy was Sabbath. And he wants us to remember how glorious is his gift of creation. And every 7 days we get to celebrate the gift of life. And Sabbath comes to us like salvation. Nothing we can do to earn it is part of God's plan of blessing for us. Because he blessed this day, he rested on it, and he made it holy. More verbs attached with creating Sabbath than any other day of the week. This is a big deal. Most of the world has forgotten it, but it's a big deal, the gift of the Sabbath. And Seventh-day Adventists think it's so important we put it in our name. You know, the Baptists, our Christian brothers and sisters, remind us the importance of baptism, so they put it in their name. And Seventh-day Adventists want to remind the world how important Sabbath is, so we put Seventh-day Adventists in our name to draw our attention to the glorious gift of this day. Well, you know, Jesus created the Sabbath a long time ago. 4,000 years after he created, he came to this world and walked on this earth as a human being. What would he do with the Sabbath? What would he do? This is his holy day. This something special that he made. The very first thing he made holy was time. And what would he do with the Sabbath? Well, I got a clue when I was reading in the Desire of Ages, where Ellen White says that Jesus performed more miracles on Sabbath than any other day of the week. And I thought, wow, that's big. He started reminding us that Sabbath is a day for miracles with his manna miracles, 40 years of manna miracles. How many miracles were attached with giving the manna? So when he comes again and walks on this earth, he wants to remind us that Sabbath is a day for miracles. And Ellen White said, indeed, he performed more miracles on Sabbath than any other day of the week. So I started looking at the Gospels, and I found 7 of them. Well, I'm guessing he performed a lot more than 7, because, and you know how the Gospel of John ends? And John writes at the end of his gospel, he says, if I wrote down everything that Jesus did, the world couldn't have contained the books. Right? Remember that. So I'm sure that Jesus did a lot more than 7, but God inspired 7 of them to be recorded in the Gospels. That's a nice number, 7, when you're dealing with Sabbath, isn't it? So this morning I want to look at Jesus' Sabbath miracles to see what we can learn about the Sabbath from what the Creator did on this day. And though the miracles are sprinkled all through the Gospels, Dr. Luke, the only Gentile that wrote a book in the Bible, includes 5 of them. So we're going to just follow his little sequence just because it's handy. Just because it's handy. It's interesting that Luke, the Gentile, writes more about the Sabbath than any of the other Gospel writers. Apparently he caught the glory of this day, and he was just excited to write about the Sabbath. So we're going to look at 5 of his in the Gospel of Luke, and then we'll move on to the last 2 in the Gospel of John. So turn to Luke, and we're going to do some drop lightly into Jesus' 5 of his Sabbath miracles. But even before we do that, I want to notice something very special about the Sabbath. You know, Jesus was a carpenter a lot longer than he was a preacher. For 30 years, he was a carpenter, and he reminds us that work of our hands is as a gift too. But then he received the call of God, and said, now is the time for your public ministry. You remember that in the Desire of Ages, how Ellen White describes this so beautifully. And Jesus answers the call to begin his public ministry, and he announces his ministry as the Messiah on a Sabbath morning. Well, how appropriate is that? Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4. We'll start in verse, let's start in verse 16. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now, I love that little refrain. We're going to see it all through Luke's discussion of Jesus' miracles, as his custom was, as his custom was. So here we find, the very beginning, Jesus, the creator of heaven and earth, loved to be with his people on the Sabbath. That was his custom. As his custom was, he went to the synagogue and stood up to read, and he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he'd opened the book, he found the place where it was written. Now, why was he handed the book of Isaiah? Have you ever wondered that? Why was he handed the scroll? Well, I should say the scroll of Isaiah. Well, even today, it's been a long, ancient tradition with the Jewish people that every Sabbath they read a part of the Old Testament until at the end of 3 years or at the end of 5 years, depending on the sequence that they will have read through the whole Old Testament on Sabbath morning in church. Now, I noticed we had a scripture reading here with just seven verses this morning, so we're getting off easy. But in a Jewish synagogue today, they spend a lot of time on Sabbath morning reading the Bible. A lot of time. And they don't have a little pulpit like this because they still use scrolls. In fact, they have a table. Their pulpit is even longer than this table here. A long pulpit up front. And at the front of every Jewish synagogue, they have what they call the ark. It's a beautiful carved cupboard that they keep all their scrolls in. And there's a scroll for every book of the Bible. And each scroll is wrapped in velvet. Royal blue or purple or scarlet. And then the two pillars, the poles that hold the scroll together are covered with a golden crown. And this is to remind them of the royal nature of God's book. So every scroll they get out, they carefully unwrap the royal velvet and the crowns, and they take it. And then even before they read it, they will walk around the perimeter of the synagogue, and the rabbi holds it on his shoulder, and they're singing praise to God for Torah, for the law, and they bring it all around. And if you want, you don't have to, you can go to the edge of the pew where the rabbi is, and you can hug the scroll, or you can take your prayer shawl and touch the scroll and then kiss it, because they express affection for God's word even before they read it. Isn't that neat? So we get so used to having the Bible around that we forget the royal nature of this book. It's an extraordinary book that God has preserved all this time through much blood so that we can have it today. And it's called the living word in Scripture. God still will meet us in this book if we will give him the time. Well, even so, Sabbath morning, apparently that Sabbath morning in Nazareth, they were in Isaiah. And so they'd taken the scroll around, and everybody had expressed affection, and they rolled it out, and Jesus found the place where it was written, and this is what he read. At least part of what he read. He probably read more, but at least he read this. Then the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted and proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. That's from Isaiah 61. So apparently they were in the book of Isaiah. And you know, this is part of the great messianic promises that are in the book of Isaiah. And the Jewish people had for hundreds of years been reading these messianic prophecies as they got to the book of Isaiah. And they were looking forward to the Messiah coming to do these things. Give sight to the blind, release the captives, and do all these wonderful things. And they knew when the Messiah came, it would be such a glorious time. And so here Jesus comes Sabbath morning. Get the feeling? Jesus comes Sabbath morning. That's where they are in Isaiah. And he reads this powerful messianic prophecy. And then he closed the books and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And it says, and the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. They well knew these words. And here comes Jesus and reads them apparently with great conviction. And the eyes of the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Wow. These long promised Messiah blessings are going to be starting to be fulfilled. Whoa. And what was the people's response? They marveled at the gracious words proceeding out of his mouth, and they said, praise God. Is that what they said? No. They said, isn't this Joseph's son? Huh? We saw this kid grow up here in Nazareth. Remember, it says he was here in Nazareth synagogue. Who is this? Huh? Isn't this Joseph's son? What's he doing? Why is he claiming all this? And you know the rest of the story. By the time they were finished that Sabbath morning, they wanted to kill Jesus. And this began Jesus' public ministry. People recognizing him as human, but refusing to recognize him as God. But it doesn't stop, the story doesn't stop there. Jesus takes every one of these promises of what the Messiah would do and fulfills them on Sabbath. Let's see how Luke shows us this. Stay in the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke chapter 4, and move on to another part of Luke chapter 4. We'll stay in Luke chapter 4, and we'll start reading in verse 31. Luke 4:31. Then he went down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. See, there's that little refrain. Jesus always loved to be with his people on the Sabbath. And they were astonished at his teaching, for his word was with authority. Now, in the synagogue, there was a man who had the spirit of an unclean demon. And he cried out while Jesus was teaching with a loud voice, saying, "Let us alone. What do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." See, remember, get the feeling here of what's going on. Jesus was teaching Sabbath morning, and right in the synagogue. Now pretend your pastor was preaching here Sabbath morning, giving a wonderful sermon. And all of a sudden, somebody is in the synagogue and the sanctuary that starts screeching, filled with a demon. My parents were missionaries when I grew up in the Far East, and I've seen demon possession. I was a little girl, and I'll never forget. It's the most frightening thing. These people's eyes are red and bulging out and bloodshot and watering, and their voice is very unnatural, and their face is contorted, and it's the most horrifying thing. Now, there's devils are real, but in this sophisticated country that we have now, he does different things to get our attention. But back in the Far East where I grew up, and in this Jesus time, he was controlling people. And here Pastor Jesus was teaching, and all of a sudden this man starts screeching in the sanctuary. But notice, who are the demons? Do you remember? What does the Bible teach us about who are demons? Who are they? The fallen angels. They used to be in heaven. And notice, they recognized Jesus even in human form. Human beings were not willing to accept Jesus as God. But notice what the demon says, "I know who you are." Jesus had come now in human form, and yet the demons still recognized him. And notice, the demons know prophecy. Have you come to destroy us? Is this the time? They know that their ultimate end is going to be destruction. And so now that Jesus is appearing, maybe that means that it's time to be destroyed. So the demons tell us they know very much what's going on. They remember prophecy. They recognize Jesus, and even in human form. And this demon-possessed man screeches right in the middle of the Sabbath sermon. But Jesus, what does he do? He shows him he's still commander. Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And when the demon had thrown him in their midst, it came out of him and did not hurt him. Then they were all amazed and spoke among themselves, saying, "What word is this? For with authority and power he commands even the unclean demons, and they come out." And the word spread about him to every place in the surrounding region. Now you would think that they would put together the prophecies that when the Messiah would come, he would do this very thing. He would release the captives. That was what was promised that the Messiah would do. The demons recognized Jesus, but not the humans. And Jesus worked this remarkable miracle. And they were so amazed. And rather than putting the pieces together and recognizing Jesus, they were just, wow, how can he do that? How can he do that? The next Sabbath miracle follows right afterwards, verse 38. Now he rose from the synagogue. This one happened at Sabbath lunch. He rose from the synagogue and entered Simon's house. But Simon's wife's mother was sick with a high fever. And they made request of him concerning her. Now, I remember I told you my parents were missionaries. My dad was a doctor at a mission clinic, and I remember him coming home, and he loved this particular miracle of Jesus. Because my dad said, I would hear him telling my mom, who was a nurse, saying, "I've studied all these diseases in medical school, but I'm coming across stuff I don't recognize, and I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. But if Jesus was here, he could rebuke a fever." Can you imagine? Not even putting medicine on a rash or taking a pill. He just rebuke a fever. Do you get the feeling of how extraordinary this is? What a great picture of Jesus' power. So he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. And immediately she arose and served them Sabbath lunch. Well, I have to admit something here. I love this detail that Dr. Luke includes about this lady. Not only the Sabbath miracle, about this lady. Immediately, the minute she was well, she rose and served them. I have to tell you, I've thought about this and thinking if I was sick with a high fever and Jesus would come to my house on a Sabbath after church and rebuke the fever and I'd be well, I would just kind of like to lay there a little longer and enjoy the rest and say, "Help yourself, there's a lot of food in the kitchen," But this great lady, apparently Luke was impressed too. The minute she was well, all she could do was think of serving lunch. Isn't that beautiful? What a neat detail about this precious lady. Precious lady. And one of the first things she could do was think of as healing. After healing was to serve lunch. Turn to Luke chapter 6 for the next Sabbath miracle. Dr. Luke gives us these wonderful Sabbath miracles. Luke chapter 6, verse 6. Luke 6, verse 6. Now it happened on another Sabbath, also that he entered the synagogue and taught. Are you starting to get that rhythm? Jesus was always in the synagogue on the Sabbath. The creator of the universe loved to be with his people on the Sabbath. Whenever Luke mentions a miracle, he says Jesus was in the synagogue on the Sabbath. If Jesus was here in Irvington this Sabbath, he'd be here. He'd want to be with us. Isn't that a beautiful picture of Jesus? Beautiful picture. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. Now, maybe he'd come in with his hand under his coat. You know, you try to hide your disabilities and your physical challenges. Maybe he did. I don't know. We had a student at the seminary who didn't have a hand. Actually, it was a wife of a student. I remember when they came to our house, at first I didn't even notice it because she kept her hand under her sweater, you know. But then afterwards we were clearing up and I could see she didn't have a hand. And it was okay. It was okay, but maybe this man came in with his hand under his coat. And notice it wasn't demon possession, so he didn't draw any attention to himself by noise. He just came into the synagogue. And his hand was withered. Now, in the original language, it says this man's hand was Xerox. Now, what do you think of when you hear the word Xerox? Copy machine, sure. So what does a copy machine have to do with a withered hand? Well, you know that before Xerox machines, printing was done by wet ink, right? And they made faster and faster drying ink, but it was wet ink, and so every now and then you have a smudged page, you know, because the page wasn't quite dry. Then someone invented dry ink. You know, when you fill a copy machine now, you put in black powder. It's dry ink, and that's why machines can print so fast, because you don't have to wait for anything to dry. And so when they invented dry printing, they used the Greek word for dry. That's why it's called Xerox. That's nobody's name. It's just they're trying to remind you of the extraordinary nature of dry ink. And this man's hand was dried, and withered is a good translation. So his right hand was withered. And the scribes and Pharisees watched Jesus closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath. Why? That they might find accusation against him. Like some Adventists I know, watching people. What are you doing on the Sabbath? These are the scribes and Pharisees, the presiding elders, see, watching Jesus to see that they might accuse him. Is that the right attitude to have on Sabbath? Presiding elders, seeing if they could accuse Jesus. But he knew their thoughts. And there's that little clue that Luke knew that Jesus was God. We don't know people's thoughts, but he knew their thoughts. And so, remember, he was teaching. It says he was teaching, and the man comes in with a withered hand. He was teaching, and Jesus interrupts his sermon. Notice, he doesn't say, please meet me in a Sabbath school room afterwards, and I'll help you. But if I do it now, I'll get you and we'll both get in trouble. No, Jesus interrupts his sermon, and he tells the man, wherever he's sitting, arise, come up here. Come up here. So he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to the congregation, to them, I will ask you one thing. He interrupts his sermon now and starts asking questions. Doesn't heal him immediately, starts asking questions. I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? Is it lawful on the Sabbath to save life or to destroy? Interesting questions, right? Now, when Luke tells us this miracle, he tells us of the scribes and Pharisees that they were watching Jesus, that they might find accusations, that they might kill him. Now, Luke doesn't include that detail, but Mark does. But Jesus knew their thoughts, and he knew that they were planning to figure out some way to kill him. These are the presiding elders, the religious leaders, wanting to kill Jesus. And so Jesus asked questions. Who's really breaking the Sabbath? He doesn't point fingers, but he says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to save life or to destroy it? You're planning to kill me, and I'm planning to restore this man's hand. Who's really keeping the Sabbath? Do you get it? Do you feel that? Is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath? You're planning murder. I'm planning restoration. Who's really breaking the Sabbath? Do you feel it? Oh, Jesus is so wise. Isn't that beautifully asked questions? He interrupts the sermon and starts asking questions. And when he looked around them all, and Mark says he looked around at them in anger, He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. And they sang praise to God for an hour afterwards. Is that what it says? No. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Here the Messiah had been promised 100 of years to come and to heal and restore and renew people. And Sabbath is the best day of all for miracles. And Jesus performs a miracle. You would think they would be saying, the Messiah must be here. Look what's happening. And instead they're so confused and mixed up about what Sabbath is all about. They want to kill Jesus because he healed someone on Sabbath. See, it's easy to be confused what Sabbath is about. I've been confused for years. I thought Sabbath was something I do for God. God, I love you, and I do. And you said this is your holy day? Okay, I'll do this for you if it kills me. Never mind what Sabbath is all about, something God does for us. Bring healing and restoration and love and acceptance to us after a week of sinning and mistakes. And God says, I'll take it all away. Come into my palace in time and let me restore you. I have the power. I'm the Messiah. On Sabbath. Instead of the Sabbath service ending with praise to God for what he had done, they filled with anger. Oh, it's frightening, isn't it? It's frightening. Frightening how mixed up we can be about Sabbath. Turn to Luke chapter 13. This is the one that we had read for scripture reading. Luke 13, verse 10. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. Do you feel it? There's that little refrain Luke always includes. I think he was impressed that the Creator loved to be with his people on Sabbath. He always includes that detail. He was teaching on the Sabbath, and behold, there was a woman there who had the spirit of infirmity 18 years and was bent over double and in no wise could straighten herself up. So here she comes to church like this. And she can't see people by the face, so she notices them by their shoes. Oh, those are cute shoes. Happy Sabbath. I recognize those shoes. They're really cute. She couldn't look at people straight in the face. She couldn't. She couldn't straighten herself up. She'd been that way for 18 years. I see some people in this congregation that don't even know how old 18 is yet. It's a long time to be sick. No doubt she was a single woman. There's a rare man that will marry a crippled woman. And notice, but she was in church. You know, sometimes we get up a Sabbath morning, oh, my stomach is a little upset, I ate too much last night. I think I'll stay home and watch 3ABN. But this lady, this beautiful woman, crippled as it was, how hard it must have been for her to get to church, she was there Sabbath morning. She hadn't a clue what was going to happen. She just wanted to be there because she knew that's where God would bless her with a Sabbath blessing. She knew that. And Jesus was teaching in the Sabbath, so you get the flavor here. Jesus was teaching, and he sees her come in. And he calls her to him. And he said, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." And he laid his hand. She was made straight in the first face she was Messiah. And she glorified God. Precious story. She hadn't a clue this was going to happen. But she wanted to be in God's house on Sabbath. Notice Jesus put his hands on her too. Do you suppose it had been a long time since this lady felt any affection? Any affection. And Jesus, who could have just healed her by saying so, and he did, but he touched her and gave her the healing affection of his Messiah touch. Oh, I love this picture of Jesus. And the presiding elder of the synagogue said, we need to praise God for an hour for this glorious miracle. Is that what it says? No. But the ruler of the synagogue, or the presiding elder, answered with indignation because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. And he said to the crowd, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. Therefore, come and be healed on them and not on the Sabbath day. As if Jesus was working when he healed. And as if this lady came to be healed, she didn't even have a clue. How confused we are sometimes about what Sabbath is about and who Jesus is. And Jesus answered him. I love this. The Lord answered, looked the ruler of the synagogue right in his eye, and he said, hypocrite. Isn't that beautiful? We can't do that. I mean, we look around at people and we think they're hypocrites, but we don't really know. We don't know. And it's inappropriate for us to call people hypocrites. But Jesus is God. And he knew that this man was a hypocrite, even though he was the presiding elder of the day. And he says, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead it away to water? And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan is bound. Think of it. For 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath. Again, Jesus has to explain what Sabbath is all about. And again, you notice the word loosed all the way through this miracle. It's the very word used of the Messiah in Isaiah 61 that he's going to loose the captives. Loose. And Jesus said she's been bound by Satan for 18 years. Loose. And so you'd think they would make that connection that the Messiah must be here. He's doing the very things that the Messiah said he would do. But no, they get angry because Jesus didn't match their ideas of what the Messiah should be like and what Sabbath should be like. And notice, he calls her a daughter of Abraham. You know the Gospels well enough to remember that many times the presiding rulers would tell Jesus, we are the sons of Abraham. We have this pedigree. Who are you? We are the sons of Abraham. And Jesus took that pedigree and gave it to this formerly crippled woman. And the only time we have in the Gospels, Jesus removed the indignity of her disease and said, she's a daughter of Abraham. Isn't that beautiful? Absolutely beautiful. Some people, pedigree is very important. Very important. I was flying once, and I happened to be sitting next to a very handsome young man, much taller than me, dressed to kill, suit, beautiful fabric, and he wanted to be sure before the trip was over that I knew his pedigree. So he told me that his ancestors came to this country on the Mayflower. So, he looked down his nose at me like I was just a nothing because I had no pedigree. But he wanted me, obviously, to be impressed with his pedigree. Now, what I did next, I'm not proud of, but I couldn't resist. So I sat up as tall as my short stature would allow me, and I looked him right in the eye and I said, well, my ancestor sailed on a very famous ship too. Oh, all of a sudden I was somebody. He looked at me with new appreciation, and he said, which ship? And I looked him right in the eye and I said, Noah's Ark. Well, you can imagine the result. He went, oh, like this. And we never had another word between us. And so maybe I think now that wasn't a wise thing to do. We maybe could have talked about important things other than pedigree if I hadn't done that. But pedigree is really important to some people, really important. And Jesus knew that. And he took this crippled lady who probably had nobody, and he gave her the highest of all pedigrees and said, she's a daughter of Abraham. I love it. And then he goes on. Again, remember when Jesus always is healing, he's asking questions and teaching and trying to get our thinking straight. So he goes on and talking. And he says, he said, whom Satan is bound, think of for 18 years, and he loosed this bond on the Sabbath. And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and the multitude rejoiced for the glorious things that were done with him. And he talked about, you people, you this morning before you came to synagogue, you took your donkey or your animal to water it. And that's appropriate. You know the Sabbath commandment blessings include the animals. Remember that. It's not just for us. Even the animals are to receive a blessing on the Sabbath. And Jesus says it's appropriate for you before you come to synagogue to lead your farm animals to water, because on Sabbath they are allowed to be a blessing of rest and comfort too. But so many of us, we've never lived on a farm. Maybe some of you do, but I'm guessing most of us don't anymore. We don't know how hard work it can be to lead an ox or a donkey to water. Maybe if they're thirsty, they'll go, but if they're not thirsty, it might be a hard job. But you know that you're going to be gone. You can't leave them to get thirsty all day long, right? So you're pulling them and pulling, come on, I've got to get to synagogue, and you're pulling them, and I can't leave you to be thirsty. So you go through all that hard work. So your animals are comfortable on Sabbath, can receive the Sabbath blessing of rest. And Jesus says, you'll do this, and that's right. He's not criticizing. He says, yes, it's absolutely right that you do this. And so should this daughter of Abraham be released and loosed from her captivity on the Sabbath. That's what Sabbath is all about. Sabbath is a day for miracles. It's a day for healing and restoration. It's not something we do for God. God said, set apart this time and let me restore you and renew you. Precious promise. Luke 14. Another Sabbath lunch miracle, Luke 14, verse 1. Now it happened as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath. They thanked him for coming. No, they watched him closely. And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy. Now, what is dropsy? We don't know. Dr. Luke was a physician, and he doesn't describe it and explain it because everybody knew then. But the ancient rabbis tell us this thing, so we're guessing this is where Jesus was, what the description would hold. The ancient rabbis at Jesus' time believed that if you were a good person, the blood and water in your blood vessels was evenly balanced. But if you committed a sin, a minor sin, mind you, the water would supersede the blood, and you would get dropsy. And if you committed a major sin, the blood would supersede the water, and you would get leprosy. So you knew if someone had dropsy or if someone had leprosy that they were sinners. You could just tell. That's what the rabbi said because of this condition. Well, this man had dropsy. And Jesus spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees, asking a question, always asking a question. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Reminding them that the promises of the Messiah were just to do these kind of things. And Jesus says Sabbath is the best day of all to do these things for miracles. But they kept silent, didn't know what to say. And he took him and healed him and let him go. And he answered them, saying, which of you having a donkey or an ox has fallen into a pit will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they couldn't answer him. Now, Jesus ups the intensity here. You see, last time it was leading an ox or donkey to water, right? Now, this is even worse. This is falling into a pit. And you know, if you've been to Israel, that there's never enough rain in the Middle East. Never enough rain. And so they have learned to save every drop of water. You know, when we get too much water here, it just goes into the sewer. But not in Israel, not in the Middle East. They have these cisterns that they've built into the fields. So if there's any runoff, it's captured in these large pits. Probably 4 of them would fit into this sanctuary, I'm guessing. And each they would have them in the field, so if there's any runoff, it would run in there, and then they could use that water later on. Nothing's wasted. But you had to make sure you kept the cover on the cistern, because there's a big room, and it could be filled with water. And so Jesus is picking up a situation they were probably used to. You know, someone forgot to put the lid on, they had extra rain, and the ox was out there, and he falls into the pit. And he's swimming and trying to get out, and panicked. Are any of you lifeguards and know how hard it is to even save a drowning person? Can you imagine a flailing ox or a donkey who's fallen into a pit of water, and you find out on Sabbath you're going to let him drown? No, Jesus says it's appropriate for you to save that life on Sabbath. It's a lot of work, but it's appropriate. Animals are under God's care. His eye is on the sparrow. Who's saying that? Where's that man that's saying that? His eye is on the sparrow. And he notices these things, and it's appropriate for us to take care of the animals on the Sabbath. Even all that work, muddy, filthy work to save an animal's life on the Sabbath. And they couldn't answer him. See, we need Sabbath to get reoriented again to Jesus and what he's like and what Sabbath is about. Let's look at the last 2 in John. John chapter 5. It was the first one, the man at the pool of Bethesda. You know the story. This man had been laying there 38 years, sick. And Jesus was walking by the pool of Bethesda. Ellen White describes the scene this way. She says that Jesus was Sabbath afternoon walking by the pool, and he would have loved to have healed everybody. But because if he knew that he did that, he would be instantly killed. Because the animosity against him and his Sabbath was so high in Jerusalem at that time that he was restrained from working miracles because of the hatred of his people. Can you imagine that? But she says he saw she puts it, particularly pathetic case, and he had to do something. So he comes up to the man and he said, would you be made well? And the man said, sir, I can't get in the water, but when the water is stirred up, I'm so weak I can't even get there, and people get in there before me. And so what does Jesus say to him? Let's pick it up verse 9. Verse 8. Jesus said to him, rise, take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man was made well and took up his bed and walked. And now John tells us that day it was the Sabbath. Can you just get the scene here? This man's been laying here 38 years sick. And all of a sudden this stranger comes by and says, take up your bed and walk. And he's walking downtown Jerusalem, kicking up his feet. He hasn't walked for 38 years, and he's so excited. Do you pick up the provocative thing Jesus did here? If Jesus had just told him, rise up and walk, the miracle would have occurred. But he tells him to carry his bed and walk. Do you feel that there?
How many people do you suppose were in downtown Jerusalem carrying their beds? Yeah, one. See, Jesus is always pushing against our ideas about the Sabbath, trying to open our eyes to the beautiful nature of this day. And instead of telling the man, just rise up and walk, he says, rise, take up your bed and walk. And so this man carrying his bed, and it worked. Ellen White says in Desire of Ages, Jesus did this deliberately to draw attention to this miracle. If he hadn't told him to carry his bed, no one would have known, but Jesus wanted people to see this miracle. So he told him to take up his bed and walk. And notice the story. It worked. The Jews therefore said to him who was healed, it is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed. See, he had gotten attention already. And he answered them, he who made me well told me to take up your bed and walk. And they said, who is this told you to take up your bed and walk? See, that little phrase, take up your bed and walk, is repeated over and over again to draw us attention to the provocative thing Jesus did. But the one who was healed didn't know who he was, for he had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place, because Jesus would have lost his life. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. And so we get a background into this situation. This man had caused his own sickness. Don't do that anymore, or something worse will happen. But Jesus still healed him. He doesn't withdraw from this man, even though he'd caused his own sickness. I love that about Jesus. It's sinners that he wants to help. And he knew this man had caused his own sickness. He says, don't do that anymore, lest a worse thing happen. And he healed him on the Sabbath to remind us that Sabbath is a day for miracles. One more, John chapter 9. The man born blind. The people, Jesus and his disciples, passed by a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, who sinned, this man or his parents, as this man was born blind? See, sometimes our sin causes physical problems, and other times we can't determine why we're sick. We can't always figure it out. Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't. And Jesus is reminding us of that. He said, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I'm the light of the world. And notice that word work, repeated over and over again. Jesus said, I'm working on the Sabbath. Working. I love his choice of vocabulary. When he said these things, he spat on the ground, made clay with the saliva, anointed the eyes of the man with the clay, and he said to him, go home and wash this off and you'll see. Is that what he says? No. Again, he doesn't keep this miracle private. Again, he tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. Where's the pool of Siloam? Do you remember your Jerusalem geography? Where's the pool of Siloam? It's right by the temple. It's the water source for all the festivals, right by the temple. And Jesus tells this man, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Oh, do you realize how many Sabbath laws he was breaking? Jesus, while gathering the clay, was plowing. He was already breaking the law. And then he made this with his saliva, this ointment, so he's putting medicine on this man's eyes. Oh, this was forbidden by the rabbis. And then he said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. You don't bathe on the Sabbath. Here he goes right by the temple and washes. And did it get attention? Oh, you bet it did. You know the story. He's caught and brought before the rulers, and they said, they can't believe he's blind. Never mind the miracle. Never mind the miracle. They say, I can't believe you were born blind. He says, I was. They brought his parents in. Was your son born blind? Yes, he was born blind. I can't believe it. Nobody has heard of anybody getting their sight. And see, they're missing the miracle. You would think they would put the pieces together. The Messiah promised in Isaiah 61, when the Messiah came, he would restore sight to the blind. Oh, you would think they would say, the Messiah must be here. Who's ever heard of anybody's sight being restored? Who would have thought? You would have think the whole city of Jerusalem would have been praising God. This is an extraordinary miracle. This man had never seen. It wasn't just an eye disease he had never seen in his life. And nobody was even praising God. They were so mad that Jesus did it on the Sabbath. So they called the man in. They said, were you really born blind? He said, yes, I was. Who healed you? He said, I don't know. He said, well, what do you think? And they said, well, he must be a prophet, because no one's heard of anybody getting their sight back before. And they kept ridiculing him. And finally the story says they excommunicated him because Jesus healed him on the Sabbath. They brought him who was formerly blind to the Pharisees. Now it was Sabbath when Jesus made the clay. Verse 14. When the Pharisees asked him again how he'd received his sight, He said, he put clay in my eyes, I washed and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Not from God, he is God. The others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? He said, he's a prophet. But the Jews did not believe him that he had been blind and received his sight. So they asked him again. And they said to his parents again, is this your son who you say was born blind? But his parents, well, you know the story. And then I love what the blind man, they called the blind man in again, verse 24. And they said to him, give God the glory. We know this man is a sinner. And he answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, though I was blind, now I see. You know that great hymn we love, Amazing Grace? You know, those words come right out of this miracle. Once was blind and now I see. Right? And we put those powerful words. And so the man gives testimony again. Verse 22, since the world has begun, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who is born blind. If this man was not from God, he could do nothing. There again, fulfilling the prophecy of the Messiah, and no one caught it. And they answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins, and you are teaching us, you old sinner, you. And they cast him out. They excommunicated him. Jesus heard they cast him out, and when he found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? And he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is him who is talking to you. And then he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. See, when you really see Jesus, that's all you can do is worship. You cannot worship. He's the first one that caught it in this whole miracle. And when he saw who Jesus was, he had to worship him. And we have two miracles of sight in this powerful chapter. First, he received his physical eyesight. And then with his physical eyesight, he got his spiritual eyesight. And he saw Jesus for who he was. And he worshiped him. Maybe we need to have our spiritual eyesight renewed again on the Sabbath. I didn't see anyone coming in with a seeing eye dog today. We all have our eyes. Some of us have glasses. But we can see. But maybe we need a Sabbath miracle for our spiritual insight. I saw no one coming in with a wheelchair or a crippled back, but maybe our spiritual condition is crippled. And we need this Sabbath to be restored. And that is what Sabbath is all about. Something God would give us this day. Amen.